Maybe we should just, she's not speaking first, right? So let's get going. It's okay. All right. So come on in, everyone. Sit down. We're going to get started with our last panel of the flexible interconnection workshop. So we went through examples of flexible interconnections, planning, operations, and now we're going to be talking about regulatory and tariff considerations for flexible interconnections. And chairing this panel, I have the honor of introducing Mark Dyson, the managing director for Rocky Mountain Institute. So Mark.
Great, thank you. Can folks hear this? No. Yes, fantastic. I'm Mark. I lead the electricity program at RMI, Rocky Mountain Institute, and I'm super excited to have this conversation with all of you, not just the Brain Trust sitting next to me, but of course the Brain Trust out there, who I expect to be heavily engaged in Q&A and dialogue, even as we hit the witching hour at the end of this conference. So hopefully there will be some good questions from the audience at the end. I really appreciate the spirit of this workshop that we've had over the course of today. As I was doing some preparation for it and sitting in the presentations and the conversations earlier today, I was reminded of the JFK quote, "Ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country." And the parallel here is, of course, ask not what the grid can do for large loads, but what large loads can do for the grid. And I think we've had a nice progression of that conversation over the course of the sessions today. I really appreciated Beth's remarks at the beginning of the last panel that operations is where the rubber meets the road. I will argue that the tariffs and other regulatory shifts are where the electrons meet the checkbooks and have the direct line of sight into costs for large load customers, benefits and value for utility systems and grids, and then how some of that shows up for other customers, not the large load customers, but residential ratepayers and other customers on the system. So to explore all of those facets of this, I'm excited to have representatives from a pretty diverse set of organizations and different perspectives here. Great to have Tyler Norris here from Google representing the large load customer perspective. Great to have Leslie from the Colorado Consumer Advocate representing that point of view around customer protection and opportunities there. And then Miles and Long are going to kick us off with some cross-cutting reflections on the national picture of how this issue is showing up, and then we'll get into the discussion. So to give you a chance to get to know the panelists a little bit before we dive into the slides, I'm going to invite each of them to give a brief introduction and in a short statement of, what perspectives are you bringing to this topic of the opportunity to use tariffs or other regulatory strategies to unlock the benefits of flexible interconnection and flexibility for large loads that we've been talking about all day today. So with that, I will invite Tyler to jump in first.
Great. Thanks, Mark. Thanks so much, ESIG, for hosting this excellent and timely conversation. Great to see you all. I'm Tyler Norris. I joined Google in November on the Advanced Energy team, which is now part of a consolidated energy and power team within the AI and technical infrastructure division. And our team does a lot of things, but partly sort of thinking about the future trajectory of the system and the future state that we want to achieve. And right now that's involving a lot of work around enabling flexible connections, whether on interconnection service, transmission service, demand response, virtual power plants, et cetera, and other ways of just maximizing utilization of the existing power system. So really, really fascinating discussion today. I feel like some of this does start to seem daunting, especially once you start to get into like the complexity of putting this into operations. And so I wanted to start by, just sort of reassuring the group that I think from our view, this is solvable and, it's already happening in that. So on the resource adequacy side for data center demand response, the bypass RA constraints, as you all know, Google has now executed a gigawatt of capacity that's under demand response agreements with US utilities. There's more of that to come. And I think there are still some barriers to making that happen at scale because it can't be an unlimited amount of potential curtailment. And there are certain parameters that sort of need to be met to make this bankable. But generally, I think we sort of know how to make it work. And I think there's a pathway there, and we know how to do ELCC accreditation, et cetera. So I feel fairly confident we can kind of keep making progress there. On the separate category of bypassing grid upgrades, and in our case, in particular, transmission upgrades, what we'd call sort of non-firm interconnection or transmission service. This is where I think there's more of the white space, and it is more complex because it's entirely new. But there again, it's already happening, right? So we have already entered into non-firm interconnection agreements on what we'd call a reactive basis, where there have been delays in the completion of network upgrades at already planned sites that were serving critical customers. And so it has happened. And the challenge is that it's been very ad hoc, one-off, very contingent on the willingness of the utility to sort of work proactively and in good faith to make it happen. And so that, in our view, is one of the sort of core value propositions of getting this standardized into some form of what we can call a tariff. And so that's why we are largely supportive of most aspects of the ANOPR as reflected in our comments and reply comments submitted last fall. If you look at them, there are a few nuances, and we want to ensure that this is also enabling of compute-based curtailment, not only co-located generation or battery storage, but we're also supportive of those use cases. And I think even most fundamentally, before we even get into the details of how to make the service workable, there's just a step of actually putting into the tariff that there should be a non-firm access option for large loads, which really doesn't exist. And so if we think about, all of this was sort of predicated on the creation of an open access transmission tariff to begin with, and then the creation of non-firm service, both transmission service and interconnection service for generators. And now we're just sort of completing the work by extending that as an access option for large loads. I know we're just sort of doing opening statements, so I'll just say that Google is very committed to helping to support the modernization of both planning and operations to enable this. So people that are doing work on this, we want to engage with you, learn about what you're finding, and find ways that we can continue to work together. And then I'm sure we'll get more into the details on sort of workable tariffs. Thanks.
Hi, everyone. I'm Miles Farmer. I'm a partner at Roselle. We are a small law firm I founded last year together with other senior staffers from the Department of Energy and FERC. So before Roselle, I was an advisor to Commissioner Clements at FERC. I've also worked in the New York Governor's Office. And in this context, we're working with a number of companies that are trying to make flexible interconnection happen. So, you heard from Gabe Tabak and Veris, we're working with them. Also, other types of companies, a thermal energy storage company, for example, that's working on trying to set up PAL, that process that you heard about in SPP, because for them, as a low load factor, flexible load, that's really important. We also do consulting type work. So in partnership with the Nicholas Institute at Duke that Tyler is affiliated with prior to his Google role, we put out a couple of reports on first how FERC could follow on the ANOPR that DOE sent to FERC on large load interconnection to enable flexible interconnection, and then also kind of a similar report with a toolkit for state regulators. And we also work with state regulators themselves as they're concerned with cost and reliability impacts, but also with economic growth and kind of making sure that we can move forward with a framework that makes sense.
Yes, this is on. Hello, everybody. My name is Long Lam. You can call me Long for short. That's a joke just to see if you're still with us. I'm bringing the dad jokes as well.
I'm here for it. Yeah, good.
Aside from being a part-time comedian, I am a managing energy associate at the Brattle Group, and we have been working with stakeholders across the power industry in answering some of these really important questions facing us today: how to integrate these large energy users into our power system in a way that is orderly and benefiting the power system as well as the existing customers. And I am in particular excited about flexibility because there's a lot of promise here. We've heard throughout the day about the time to power, the speed to power. And I think that if we do this in a responsible way, we can actually reduce rates for existing customers as well. And in order to do that, however, we need to do it in an integrated way. We need to integrate flexibility into our planning processes, and we need to be very intentional about tariff design. We need to figure out how to incorporate these flexibility elements when designing tariffs for the large load customers and leveraging the power that they can bring in order to reduce the system costs for everybody. And I'm happy to dive into the specifics and share some of the studies and findings that we have done in the next minutes.
Hi, my name is Leslie Henry Sarmos. I don't have dad jokes, but I hope that this is as lively as a presentation as a consumer advocate can bring for you. As I sit here, well, other than being a rate and financial analyst for UCA, last year I became the director or in charge of the unit that does resource planning for our office. And I'm leading a team that has been doing this longer than I've been at my office. I've been with the UCA 3 years, but most of the people I work with have been there between 10 and 20 years. And as we're working on different issues, and today I came fresh from a hearing on a rate case, I was thinking how rate making in traditional planning, which is kind of originally what I got the title for, doesn't really apply for large loads. Large loads have really become a disruptor on how we perceive regular rate making and planning in system planning. Here in Colorado, we're, I don't know if late adopters, but we are now trying to adopt a large load tariff. And the discussion derived from a multi-step process that began with our state goals for decarbonization, that led to a new energy resource plan or ERP, and eventually we're now sitting on a proceeding for a large load tariff, which derived from that. And when we first started that ERP, which was called the Just Transition Solicitation, the utility that presented this proceeding came with a request for an authorization or a forecast of approximately 14,000 new megawatts of demand, which is huge for us. So we were kind of caught in the bright lights of this. I was thinking when we saw this, and I was fresh in this new position, I was thinking, you know, it made me think of this SNL character, the cave lawyer. I don't know, caveman lawyer. I don't know if any of you are familiar. And I was thinking, man, all these terms and all these new things, and this is not traditional planning. And I was thinking, maybe this is not what I signed up for. I'm just a caveman lawyer woman, you know. So I think more than to just share the experience of Colorado, I'm here in the process of absorbing from the experience of this great panel that we have here. And I'll be glad to share where we are, how we got here in this process, and what we're hoping to achieve, not just with our large load tariff, but also what we're hoping to see with this NOPR that nobody knows.
Great. Well, we've got 4 folks on the front lines of this in different ways. So looking forward to digging in. I'll invite Miles to come up and use the podium to present here just a quick overview of some of the key concepts and the work that you and your team have done on this topic. And then we'll go to some similar material from Long, and then we'll jump into the conversation. But over to you, sir.
All right, thank you. And I'll try to keep it quick so that we can focus mostly on the discussion, but okay. So, yeah, thinking about, I guess our panel is on tariff design, right? So thinking about what rules are actually written down that apply to everybody, that is generally a tariff. And okay, but first, and this is probably too basic for this audience at this point, but I do want to focus on a couple of things about load flexibility. First, I mean, one, people have talked about this, but we're talking not just about reducing or shifting the consumption of the load. That can be an important component, as Tyler was mentioning, you know, compute reductions, but also on-site or adjacent supply resources. And that becomes really important because the jurisdiction over those resources is often separate from the jurisdiction over the load interconnection. The current process for large generators is that FERC oversees that, whereas the states have generally overseen the load interconnection process. So why is flexibility important in the first place? It can be used to avoid distribution, transmission, generation infrastructure if operated in a manner to do so. And how can it deliver speed to power? To do that, it needs to be accounted for in the interconnection process. And that's really the key. And I think people have talked about it on some of the other panels, particularly with data centers, which are driving the discussion around large loads right now. They're not the only type of large load, but their kind of market incentives for flexibility are much less important than the ability to potentially get online faster. And what we're seeing across the country with grid operators struggling to have enough supply to meet this growing demand. So what do we see in tariffs? I'll just be going through kind of some of the large load tariffs that have emerged. As I prepped for this session, I did look, EEI publishes a set of large load tariffs. It's kind of dizzying to keep up, right? There's been so many different proceedings across the country. I would say, generally speaking, the aspects of that we're seeing regulated by tariff for large loads are not the center of the discussion for flexibility. And if anything, they're actively undermining the potential for flexibility. So there has been a good reason for these tariff measures. Generally speaking, they're designed to protect customers against the risk of stranded costs, right? And to protect customers in the face of increased costs as we are having trouble meeting demand with supply that has not been connecting fast enough. So what are we seeing? We're seeing minimum billing provisions, minimum contract term, things like collateral security requirements, requirements around assigning costs of network infrastructure. All of these things, you know, can be good measures to protect consumers. If they are set in a manner that is cost reflective, then that naturally incentivizes flexible load interconnection as well, because if you are flexible and you're operated in a fashion that avoids infrastructure build out, then your minimum billing terms, minimum contract demand, collateral requirements, those would all kind of go down automatically. I think what we are seeing in the regulatory space is often those requirements are set in more of a rough justice fashion, which can make sense. But if you're doing that, then it makes sense to separately define a large load class of customers and treat them differently. So, I mean, this kind of gets back up to the first. We see qualifying eligibility thresholds, and a lot of the tariffs that are out there, they have size thresholds, they have voltage thresholds for what the interconnection is to. Sometimes there are load utilization factor qualification requirements, which require a high load utilization factor, which, you know, a flexible data center might be able to meet. A thermal battery storage would not kind of naturally fit the bill for a high load utilization factor. And so what we've recommended is that regulators at the state level define a flexible load class and think about setting a a threshold of curtailment capability that it has, a response time, duration, availability, things like that. So that to the extent you're setting these kind of rough justice rules, you could come up with some generic rules about the reduced impacts. But the big one is interconnection process rules. And I will say generally, if you look across utilities throughout the country, there isn't much in the way of tariffs around load interconnection. And that is very, very different from the way FERC does things on the generator interconnection side. For generator interconnection, there are hundreds of pages of tariff that FERC has written and that utilities have, there's a pro forma utilities have filed, and there's lots and lots of rules. I think there are pros and cons to writing things down in tariff. It becomes a little less flexible. On the other hand, it is a kind of consistent set of rules that the marketplace can understand and invest around, and that you have some kind of guarantee of regulatory process before changes will be made. But the key thing from the flexible interconnection perspective that I think we need to make work in order for investments to start getting made to render loads flexible is to expedite the interconnection of flexible loads. And what could that mean in tariff? I think it could mean two different types of things. First, it could mean a queue priority for that class, right? Like in an environment where we are short on supply, having customers that use less of that supply is advantageous, right? So there could just be, all right, we'll process you first because you're offering economic growth and other things without the same set of impacts. So for serial studies, you have a rule, you're up next. For cluster processes, it could be you're in the next cluster. I mean, some of the utilities that are starting to run cluster processes are already backed up 15 years, right? So you would start seeing some investments pretty quickly if it got you into the next cluster. And then also thinking about tariffs, I think it's important to understand that we should be thinking about both FERC tariffs and state regulated utility tariffs that are filed with state commissions. We don't know what FERC will do tonight or tomorrow in this large load ANOPR, and DOE has proposed that they take jurisdiction over large load interconnection above a certain size threshold to the transmission system. Were FERC to do that, then those interconnection processes would become FERC jurisdictional, but states would still have a lot of jurisdiction. They would have jurisdiction over distribution connected large loads. They would have jurisdiction over the retail service terms for the retail customers. And I also think a lot of people are predicting that FERC may not stretch that far. Perhaps FERC will regulate, for example, hybrid facilities that involve both generation and load. In that case, you could have a set of FERC rules here and a set of state rules around interconnection. The other important thing is that the connection to the operational framework. And to make flexible interconnection work, you need the ability to have visibility for the system operator to be able to order curtailments and to schedule that service. So you may still involve FERC jurisdictional terms for those aspects of transmission service that then flow down, even if states are retaining their jurisdiction over the load interconnection process. Now, states would be setting rules for the retail service territory. So the benefit of this is that either actor could conceivably step in to enable expedited interconnection for flexible customers. On the other hand, I think there is definitely a risk of regulators pointing at each other, of confusion between those terms, and of challenge to coordinate the different processes, right? Where to truly avoid infrastructure spend, you need that flexibility to ultimately be reflected through to the FERC jurisdictional transmission planning processes. And so you need some degree of cooperation no matter what. That then also gets into the load forecasting process, which is already a process that involves a lot of collaboration between regulators. It depends on which region you're in, but taking PJM as one example, they have a process where the EDCs provide data to PJM. PJM runs its own load forecasting model on top of that. And generally speaking, I think ESIG is leading the charge in figuring this all out, but there has not been a lot of recognition in those processes of load flexibility and what it could mean. And then finally, we're also seeing the potential for demand flexibility exchanges. So large load customers, some of them are very inflexible, right? Like they have critical loads that need to be there, but they have deep pockets and a very strong desire to get onto the grid quickly. And so you could see contracting take place with other types of loads that might be able to curtail. An example on that front that you could end up seeing baked into tariffs is New Jersey, where they just put out this bill in the Senate, S731, and that directs the BPU to, which is their retail regulator, identify parameters for demand reduction trade programs, and then ensure that the utilities come in with the load forecasting process that reflects those trades. So that's kind of yet another type of flexibility that we could see here. And then that also connects through to the prioritization of interconnection. I should note, one thing we've seen in addition to desire to prioritize flexible loads, there's also just the bring your own capacity. Some states might want bring your own clean capacity. So we can see those types of values reflected in the prioritization of interconnection, where flexible interconnection could be among them. So yeah, I guess just to sum it up, speed to power is the strongest incentive. I will also note urgency matters here. I think that there's a bit of a competition to bring load, and ERCOT, is certainly excelling in how quickly they're able to act. So I'll stop there.
Great. Thank you, Miles. I noticed that you included the Beyonce acronym without saying it out loud, which is a real missed opportunity, but I do appreciate that. Long, I'd love to have you up and share your perspective before we get into the conversation.
Thank you. And that also caught my eyes. I think that's the first time that I've seen bring your own new clean energy as a Beyonce acronym in a state legislation. That was the state legislation.
But they didn't use that acronym themselves.
Okay, all right.
That is a missed opportunity.
That was a big missed opportunity. All right, thank you. So couple of points that I want to make with my slides, and then we'll move on with the discussion. Flexibility traditionally focuses on resource adequacy, and our friends at the Electric Power Research Institute, EPRI, put together this awesome database that I encourage you to check out. You can see here that flexible load offerings are available in most of the states in the US. So for example, this large power contract service offered by Black Hills Energy in Wyoming, where the utility and Microsoft then enter into an agreement where the utility can reach into the natural gas backup generators that Microsoft has on site in order to address grid constraints or peak demand, for example. And then that was in 2016. So 10 years ago, with the wave of large customers, data centers wanting to connect really quickly, there has been a new focus on flexibility. And we are seeing programs offered by utilities across the country, by Evergy, for example, with their demand response and local generation rider, with Idaho Power, Flex Peak program. I would say that many of these utility programs still focus on the RA piece, where we are seeing a lot of flexible interconnection initiatives that address that leverage flexibility to address transmission constraints and transmission needs. It's in the RTO. So we heard a lot about what ERCOT is doing, what SPP is doing. The nice thing about doing the panel doing this last panel is that you have already heard the earlier panels talk about their programs, so I don't have to explain them. There are also special contracts that utilities and large energy users are striking. So, for example, Tyler mentioned the programs that Google has signed with utilities across the country. I would love to hear more specifics on the terms if we can disclose. But that is all to say that there is now a new big focus on flexibility as a transmission resource as well. And time to power, again, is the reason that many large energy users, many data centers are interested in this. But I would argue that you can also leverage flexibility in order to benefit existing customers by improving system utilization. So by spreading the system fixed costs across more megawatt hours, across more billing determinants, you can lower rates for everybody. And you can increase system utilization in many ways. And you guys have already seen this in the last couple of days. You can add load in location where there is available capacity, or you can add loads at times when there is spare capacity. Alternatively, you can incentivize technologies and behavioral changes that reduce peak demand of existing load. And this is an example of this is what Google and Voltus just introduced, I think last month or this month, where basically Voltus will aggregate all of these distributed energy resources and present that as capacity for to offset Google's capacity need, for example. And what this does is that it can reduce customer bills and accelerate connection of new load, and it will still allow utilities to increase their earnings. In this study that we put out earlier this year, we show that if under status quo, if you just add the new load with no improvement in system utilization and you socialize all of the costs of serving new customers, because the incremental costs are higher in this example and in many jurisdictions across the US, what we would see is that rates for existing customers will increase. And in this study, we found that rate increase is about 1.4%. But if you increase system utilization by, say, just 10%, you can reduce rates by 3.4%, all else equal. And we have a number of scenarios in the study that show significant upside if, say, for example, DARs are more impactful or are available at a lower cost. This is a proof of concept study, and but it can be applied to different jurisdictions across the country. What I would caution, however, is that this outcome is not a guarantee. You have to be very intentional with integrating flexibility into tariff design. So in this study that we are doing with ESIG, on the Task Force on Large Load Rate Impacts, what we are doing is to quantify what the rate impacts on existing customers would be when a large customer is added, a new large customer is added to the system. And here, if we are quantifying the delta, the difference in rate for existing customer with and without that large customer. So under the conditions that we selected, and for this example, you can see in the blue line that there will be some cost increase for existing customer because, again, of the cost socialization and because the incremental costs are higher than the average cost today. And with co-located generation in this example, there are some benefits in the beginning as the load is ramping up in this example in 2030, but that benefit evaporates very quickly. And that is because in this example, the large customer is able to reduce their billing determinant with the co-located generation. So what happens if you say that actually, no, thank you so much for bringing your own generation to the system, and we'll connect you faster, but you still have to pay the minimum billing demand, in this case, 80%. And you can see that the pink line shows that the delta in rate for existing customer is lower in that case. And finally, we also need to be really thoughtful about integrating flexibility into our system planning processes, because there's really it's not very good for the system if you bring your own generation capacity and it's not reflected in system planning whatsoever. If you bring in your 500 gas plant and then the system is building another 500 gas plant, so it's it's a wash. It's actually more expensive for existing customers as well. So in this figure, we are showing what the rate impact would look like if the co-located gen, in this case, receives various levels of accreditation value under grid. And as you can see, more accreditation value means lower rate impact for existing customers, and even lower negative rate impacts for existing customers. But yeah, let me end here and then we can open for discussion.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Long and Miles, for sharing some of your thoughts and research. I'd actually like to pick up on this topic with a question over to Leslie. You, in your presentation, Long, highlighted the potential cost savings to everybody, to other customers, due to increased utilization of the system. You said that kind of comes with sensitivities around the details, which I think are really important. And then, Miles, in your presentation, you also talked about the importance of, and we've seen this also today in the rest of the presentations before this panel, around the importance of having an expedited interconnection process for large loads that are flexible. And when I put on my consumer advocate hat, and I'm going to ask the real one in a second here, I think both of those things are either really exciting or a little worrisome, right? Because the details matter for both things. So with that preamble, Leslie, I guess I'm just curious your excitement about the potential that you're seeing in the analysis, as well as any concerns that we, considering the tariff opportunities, need to be aware of to make sure they work for all customers.
I think at our office, we've decided to look at this as not just large loads being a threat, but an opportunity, as you were mentioning. There's great opportunity for multiple things with the inclusion of these large loads. Hence, we are not opposed to them coming to our state, for example. I know that at the legislative level, there has been a lot of discussion on whether the state is open for business for large loads or not. So we're starting at the very basics, still there. I think at the regulatory level, we've decided to go a step further in assuming that we're trying to integrate these large loads to our system, and to do that with a consideration for correct cost allocation and value flexibility, as you were indicating. Value those customers, and that can provide quick ramp ups or curtailments, and try to work with them. And part of the commercial principles that we're trying to integrate into our large load tariff are considering those issues, and are considering not just the consumer side and the consumer protections, but the system reliability and all these other issues that we want to see reflected there. And I think that the importance of having a tariff is we have established process. And if you check the points, I think we can provide an expedited process that maintains that level of adaptability that we want to see of those customers that are doing things right, and we want to encourage that. So I think the importance is having a plain level field for everybody, and with specific considerations, and maintaining in mind that yes, We have, we developed this tariff with consumer protections in mind, but not just that. We're trying to also integrate that. We're trying to be friendly to these loads. There's value to what they're doing. There's value that they can aggregate to the system. Let's try to work together.
Great, thank you. That's a very optimistic tone, which I appreciate.
I know. I'm cautiously optimistic. That's my title and my office is cautiously optimistic.
Love that. Tyler, I wanted to bring you back into the conversation. One of the things that Miles said actually that struck me was the importance of standardization and having something that kind of the rules apply to everybody. And that would require something new, right? Like a new tariff structure, for example. I guess I wanted to get your perspective first on what's working right now already well enough. You mentioned your company's gigawatt of DR capacity contracts. Long mentioned the recent 100 megawatt deal for offsite flexibility. So these are maybe two examples, and maybe you have more of kind of things that are working within the existing constructs that maybe we shouldn't throw out with the bathwater. Does that make sense? I'd love your reaction.
Yeah. Sure thing. I can comment first on the demand response deals that have been announced with 5 utilities, and those have all been on sort of a bilateral basis. I think where we hope to see greater scale and opportunity are in the organized markets where standardization becomes much more important. And so this is really right now, PJM is sort of the tip of the spear here because as you all know, it's a very challenging situation. There's a serious, sort of RA shortage, although that's also sort of related to the load forecast method, et cetera. But because of what's been proposed as this sort of what they're calling connect and manage, although it's not, or connect and manage is a totally different definition of connect and manage. That is very motivating for entities like Google to more proactively participate by bidding our own data centers in under demand response for the base residual auction. But the problem is that there's only one service tier available for demand response, and it requires 24/7, 365 availability. Now, that was a change that occurred a couple of years ago, actually, in response to requests from aggregators to sort of boost the LCC, but it's not possible given that we just have to have some parameterization. So we've already requested to PJM that they establish a new tier. And I mean, the most important metric to just think is just that it would have a maximum of 100 hours a year, which a lot of analysis suggests can provide very significant ELCC, perhaps even on par, frankly, with thermal resources. We've found that in other jurisdictions that are doing modeling in SPP. And for reasons that are a little bit perplexing to us, PJM has not been favorable to doing that just yet. And mostly their response has been, well, we just changed it, so we can't change it again. But we're obviously in an extraordinary situation now. So we're hoping that we can get that done here in the next few months, because we're hopeful that can unlock some meaningful capacity. So that's kind of for our own demand response capability. For VPPs, you mentioned the announcement, 100 megawatts so far. I think there's a lot of ambition to do more than that. So I think we're excited about more to come there. It's interesting when you sort of ask the aggregators, sort of like, what are the 1 or 2 or 3 like biggest ongoing obstacles to really scaling this? And what you sort of get are like 10 different death by 1,000 cuts, but it's 10 cuts, right? And each of them are sort of incremental. And so I think we're trying to figure out like what can we do that would actually enable us at a larger scale. So that's kind of tip of the spear in PJM. There's more we could talk about in each of the other jurisdictions, but yeah. And then in terms of the non-firm interconnection transmission service, in most jurisdictions, it's just non-existent, right? The ability to actually proactively bypass grid upgrades. And I want to say one other thing about it, because I think it's easy to look at this only through the lens of speed to power, right? Where we're just trying to accelerate more data centers onto the grid more quickly. And there are benefits to that, as we discussed. There are also, I think, some legitimate concerns in some jurisdictions. But the other side of this, which I think is really important, is that we are seeing a significant amount of data center capacity now go either partially off grid or fully off grid. And well, first off, why is that happening? Well, we think it's in part because we have a fully binary structure right now where you either have to fully firm interconnection / transmission service or you have to go off grid. But a lot of those sites are now locked in and they're going to be running on really low efficiency thermal gas units. Unfortunately, not in all cases, right? A lot of them will hopefully have co-located renewables as well to sort of drive down the capacity factor of those thermal units, but a lot of them won't. And so from a system optimization standpoint, the sooner that we can get those sites any form of grid connection, even if it's entirely non-firm, such that they can access the as available energy only supply on the grid as soon as possible so that they can reduce the need to run the inefficient on-site thermal units, everyone wins, right? We get more economic optimization and we can reduce emissions. And so that for us and for me also personally, I think is another reason why it's so important that we, on a voluntary basis, at least make this available everywhere in a standardized way. And of course, there's always devil in the details. So we could sort of go there next if we want to, but that's our perspective.
Yeah. Awesome. Yeah, I was hoping you had mentioned that. I'd love to pull the thread over the next few minutes about what's required for a tariff to actually let that happen on a voluntary basis. Miles, I might ask you to jump in here since you brought up the kind of standardization and we're probably thinking about this perspective. What for you is the most important determinant of whether any kind of tariff strategy at the federal level or what states can do could help provide that bridge back onto the grid for some of these campuses that are currently being built or already running on behind the meter gas inefficiently?
Right. So I think Tyler said it, which is that currently virtually all of the interconnection processes do not have a path for modeling non-firm load. And I mean, we encounter this with clients who have non-firm load. They're being modeled as though they're firm. And so that's the problem, because then when you come in, you're going to trigger a series of network upgrades. You're going to be waiting. You're going to be triggering costs, et cetera. With regard to how to get there in a tariff, I will say it's challenging to write down the right set of rules. I mean, even on the generator side, where there are a lot of rules written down in the tariff, they do not generally get into the weeds of how the model will be done. And you want some ability to learn as you go to improve your models. But I do think that if utilities don't start writing down rules that do this, you're going to see regulators force them into tariffs. And ultimately, yeah, you need a path that allows a non-firm connection. Also, in an ideal world, you would actually offer an array of options, right? Like we heard earlier from SPP, who has been a real leader here, that there's the kind of chills service that is a pathway for a temporary connection for a load customer that ultimately wants firm service, but then also the PALS service that fills a different niche that, if you're a customer that's, for example, a thermal battery that's inherently flexible and you don't ultimately want a firm grid connection, you need that too. I was also excited to hear about these sort of medium tier, because we did a series of interviews when we were writing these papers about what FERC can do, about what states can do. And I would say one of the biggest challenges from the developer side that we were hearing from load developers was they need some certainty around how often they're going to be curtailed. And I think that's a bit harder in the interconnection context than it is in the wholesale grid operations context, where you can at least see, the dispatch patterns, et cetera, how things have gone. And there's maybe less visibility over when like a specific transmission constraint will be triggered. And so I was encouraged to hear the development of a number of options that allow you that middle tier. And that will come with it probably some more cost allocation, because you are taking some headroom, but also with that type of tier, you will increase grid utilization, you'll be bringing value to the system, and you'll have more certainty to plan around as developers, because the loads are achieving this flexibility through a set of investments, whether it be in storage or software processes or other things.
I think there's also the transparency piece that is super important to consider doing this via tariff. I agree that you are not going to be able to spell out every little detail, but at the very least, you can provide a framework through which people can make sense of the interconnection process and the flexible interconnection options, for example, because, and also the cost allocation piece, which frankly is probably going to be one of the more controversial pieces. And if you don't have a tariff in place and you just deal with interconnection requests on a one-off basis, there will be a lot of questions about who is causing all of these costs and who should be paying for them.
One long sounds like a consumer advocate.
Because I'm sitting next to you.
Yeah, I completely agree, and I'm glad you brought this up. I think in my background, and I've been in the energy regulation world for 20 some years, we haven't been in the position of having to make these decisions like this. Usually you would see bilateral agreements that took care of these issues, and maybe the commission would later just give it a rubber stamp of those agreements. Now we're trying to be more proactive. Obviously we can't cover it all because not all large loads are created equal, as you indicated. So there's only certain things that would be under the tariffs control. But within that, I think it's important to manage those things that are under our control and give the opportunity to be flexible if within that sphere. So thank you, Lon, for bringing it up.
I said I'd mention an example to Miles' point about how often there's been a lack of detail in the tariff around the modeling standards and the implications of this. And so why the details matter, but also why you probably can't put everything in the tariff. So there always has to be the next layer of sort of engagement. And I mean, the quintessential example is the creation of non-firm service for generators in the form of energy resource interconnection service. And so actually we have 2 new papers in preprint out this week with Lawrence Berkeley Lab and our lab, where we looked at 20 years of interconnection cost data and interconnection requests to sort of do a full kind of statistical analysis of ERIS versus NRIS cost and other performance metrics. And what we effectively find is that ERIS in most cases is not actually functioned as a non-firm access option, and that actually in terms of both cost and timeline to interconnection, its performance has eroded to the point where it's nearly equivalent with network resource interconnection service. So if you're interested in those papers, they've just been posted. One is called "Is Energy Only Interconnection Working? Empirical Evidence from 2 Decades of U.S. Market Data." And the other, it's a companion paper called "A Review of U.S. Energy Only Generator Interconnection Service Policy and Considerations for Reform." So it's sort of a cautionary tale, right? Of yes, it's good to put it in a tariff to have the existence of an alternative option, but there's always devil in the detail.
Yeah, let me pile on with a related question that came up for me as I was thinking about the way to use your time on this panel, all of you. There's a lot of possible benefits from flexibility that we've seen presented on the slides here, on the slides in the previous sessions. I wonder, there's maybe an understandable concern that if we standardize all of that into a tariff, it might perhaps average away some of the highest benefit opportunities to take advantage of flexibility. And I'd love whoever wants to start, your take on that, right? Are we potentially sub-optimizing the value that we could get out of large load flexibility and flexible interconnection if we have a very standardized solution? Or is that not actually a concern that we should be worried about? Who wants to take that?
I mean, I'm happy to take the bait a little bit. Sorry, is this on now? Okay. I think the risk of that is far, far lower than the risk of not writing down some rules that push people forward. I think that we are at a place where loads are interconnecting under a set of rules that is not incentivizing all of this good behavior. And it's pretty easy to write down a tariff that says, and you could do more, and you could set up a special contract for that if you want, right? So definitely write that into your rules. but also to kind of the points that were raised earlier about something high level, like I think a tariff for flexible interconnection, it can almost be as simple as a directive. You must offer a path that allows for a load to put in its parameters for curtailment that you reflect into your model, right? Like it doesn't have to be all of the details of how the model is done. And then, on the other side, like I think that where you do have to have a little more kind of grouping of things into specific products is around the transmission service that you're taking, right? So like if you're setting up a non-firm transmission service, you do have to have a specific set of rules, and the transmission service that works for customer A might not be the ideal transmission service for customer B. But right now, like that problem already exists. Like you can only take at the wholesale level, like network integration transmission service or point-to-point service, and you don't have a lot of options. So I think like adding to the mix will be good, and you can always layer on there different retail service options that are contracted above the wholesale level. But certainly also for the smaller players that have not they're developing new products. The fact that we're doing all of this via secret contract makes it harder to develop those new products, I would say.
Yeah, I'll just generally agree and say, I think there's a way, you could do it at the highest level, which is just to say, transmission providers shall provide an option to access the transmission system on an as available basis for large loads. And we already have a lot of sort of records, right, on like what as available means. There's a lot of precedent that we can work with there. So I think, and then you can always go into more detail, but even just having that, I think would be a big step forward.
I just wanted to agree also with what you were saying. Let's not forget that it's not a perfect solution, but the problem is here and it's going to continue because the speed of the way technology moves, it's a lot faster than the speed of regulators and the rate making process. So this is to be expected, but it's not a perfect system, but it's better than not having any guidance or any framework to work with. So I think it's an issue to be expected, especially because of the type of technologies that we're working with.
Yeah, heard loud and clear. Don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good.
Right.
And I'm glad that I was able to toss up that softball for the panel to just like bat out of the air. Thank you.
We're sitting here and we're talking about all these new technologies and this new problem when we are like in other cases, we're still talking about, in other proceedings, we're still talking about cases and quoting laws that were from or decisions that were issued that still prevail in the regulatory process from, 1920 and stuff. So it's not a perfect process, but it's better.
We can do better. Yeah. Well, let's shift gears a little bit and talk about what's coming down the pike later this week. So as has been mentioned already a couple times today, we're expecting FERC orders and an open meeting tomorrow on this topic. And I'd like to invite the panelists to share either a hope or a deepest fear about what's going to be issued in the order, what's going to be the topic of the open meeting. And I think that'll set us up for the rest of the conversation around, how can we, in the various spheres of agency that we have outside of what happens at FERC tomorrow, continue to make progress on this topic. So Tyler, can I ask you to go first with a hope or a fear about what's coming down the pike?
Yeah. Sure thing. So in our comments, the main thrust is that we strongly support the creation of non-firm access options for large loads that bring either co-located generation, battery storage, electrically proximate generation or storage, or the ability to curtail their own load. And there are a variety of ways this can be done, but generally we want to see that service option codified. We also want to emphasize, too, and we put this in the comments, that it's really important to not overstate even if there is a jurisdictional play there, to not overstate the implications given how much jurisdiction the states will retain inherently over many, many other forms of retail service. So I think there's been a little bit, maybe by some commentators, sort of overemphasizing how significant, even if there is jurisdiction taken, what the implications are. But I think, as Miles said, right, there's also a way they can do this that may not even sort of go in that jurisdictional direction. So, yeah, I think generally, all else equal, we'd prefer to see a full NOPR here and then have another round of comments and then just get this fully codified so that we all just have clarity, standardization. We did this for generators. I don't see any reason why we can't do it for loads, and we should be building this for the long term, right? We've had Order 2003 establishing, non-firm and firm interconnection service for generators since the year 2003. We should be taking the long view out, to mid-century and beyond. Like, we're trying to build a system that can last and be enabling a variety of different arrangements. So some might say that doing it as a full NOPR makes it perhaps more legally indefensible. There may be more legally contentious sort of efforts to come. And we have assured FERC that, if what's released aligns generally with what we've commented on and supportive, that Google will defend it legally. So we're willing to do that if it's necessary to get this established. But there may be other ways to do it, right? And maybe Miles wants to talk about the option of this 206 approach and what that might look like.
All right. Yeah, you added to my plate here. Okay. So, but I guess hope and fear. A hope is, and I'm optimistic about this. When the ANOPR was sketched out by the Department of Energy, it was a sketch, right? It was just a few pages long, not the sort of detail around how you would actually implement this. And it was missing, I would say, like some ingredients. So very exciting in there. It included the line, expedite interconnection for flexible large loads, right? So that is good. I hope they follow through on spelling out what that means. And there were a few things that weren't in the ANOPR that some of our clients put into the record around, for example, ensuring that it comes with a transmission service framework around it, because you've got to connect the operations, the interconnection, and that it spells out what it means to expedite interconnection and does kind of delve a bit into the weeds around study assumptions such that those study assumptions can take place in a manner that reflects flexibility. Another hope, I would say, is that we have a fast pathway for implementation. Tyler was referring to this option of 206s. There's something the commission could do is actually short of a full rule, which might go through a whole rulemaking process of notice of proposed rulemaking. Final rule would be to skip to issue orders to show cause for transmission providers across the country and kind of jump right to the implementation phase, which would ask the question to them, basically, show us why your tariff isn't unjust and unreasonable, because it looks like it might be. And if you agree it might be, actually just step to fixing it, please, right away. So that could be exciting. On the fear side, I fear that if FERC doesn't actually take the full step of taking jurisdiction over the load interconnection process, that it could become difficult to link up the operations framework with the interconnection framework, and that it could be difficult to sort out the interconnection of gen and load, particularly where the gen is behind the meter. So, we'll see, but I fear a bit that, like, I've already encountered this, regulators or, in the state side process saying, well, we can't do flexible interconnection. That depends on the federal regulators, right? And so there could be that challenge that emerges where, states might be happy that FERC isn't stepping into their jurisdiction, but actually it may make it harder to achieve some of those objectives.
I would echo that. I would hope that there will be a accelerated path to connection in this NOPR, taking into account loads, flexibility, capability, number one, and then number two, I hope that there will be a clear federal and state boundary in this NOPR as well. but at the same time being married to a lawyer, I worry that there will be a protracted legal battle. Even if FERC is going to strike, the most balanced position here, that it will be a protracted battle, and in 2030 we'll still be talking about the same thing. And I think that would be our biggest worry.
Our office didn't directly participate issuing comments in the pre-NOPR, but the AG's office for the state of Colorado did. So I'm going to echo some of their comments and then provide like our own personal wish list. So what some of the comments that we worked together with the AG's office on were first, consumer protections. Of course, that's basic for us and the starting point of our comments. Second is we requested that in the process, FERC respect the jurisdiction of states when it comes to distribution systems and distribution system planning and operations, and that they respect states' authorities over retail rate making. So I think those are our starting points. In addition to that, we definitely would like to see that large loads, of course, paid for all the costs that they cost to the system. So cost causation and cost allocation are basic for us, including not just any new addition of new generation or transmission, but also any other associated costs to this, operation and maintenance costs, and all other associated. That's the final text I was telling Miles of how we would frame that is, and all other costs associated with these large loads. And finally, create a value for flexibility, as I mentioned before. That would be our wish list.
Can I add one more thing? Sure. So your comment about cost allocation reminded me that I think it would be really great if FERC can clarify that voluntary and pricing is kosher, meaning that in cost allocation, you don't have to do or pricing, meaning that you assign the cost to load either the average cost or the incremental cost, that it's okay to assign the incremental cost of, say, network upgrade and the embedded cost as well. There's been a lot of confusion as to whether that is allowed under FERC's rules. I think a lot of lawyers say that that's not allowed, and some utilities put out papers saying that that's not allowed. But in my opinion, if the load is willing to pay for it and the utility is willing to charge it, so I don't think it should be illegal, especially if that's going to benefit existing customers.
Great. Well, yeah, I wanted to pick up on this theme, actually. Maybe to frame up the question, I think I've heard a lot of agreement on this panel, which is always good for the end of the day. But just to keep the energy up, I'm curious if we can dive into a few areas where there might not be as much agreement, or where, I think you said earlier, Tyler, that the devil is in the details as we get these things in place. What are some of the details that you imagine over the next 3 months, 6 months, as whatever happens tomorrow at FERC goes through its process? What are some of the details that are going to be the points of contention that we need to be paying attention to? Can I start with you again?
Yeah. So I think one of the biggest questions here is, to the extent that this is leading towards sort of real-time market integration, either via security constrained economic dispatch or security constrained unit commitment. Bunch of questions that raises around sort of real-time telemetry requirements, SCADA, and then if there's the option for sort of being price responsive to have fully as available access, then some of the issues that came up in the last panel around sort of bid pricing and capping and sort of the method around that. I think that could raise some really interesting questions around market design. And I think if you get it wrong, it could just make the product unusable for a variety of loads. So I think that that's a big one. This may have been already alluded to, but one of our worries about what FERC may do tomorrow, and we said this very clearly in our comments and everything we've said to them, is that, you know, we want it to be technology neutral and to not selectively favor, you know, one fuel type over another. And so I think there is a scenario where this almost becomes entirely about co-located thermal, essentially. And there are some issues that have come up, for example, in PJM's compliance filing around what FERC ordered them to do on co-location in December that would effectively prevent the use of battery storage as a co-located asset to enable this this kind of flexible service. And so that would be very unfortunate in our view. And so we don't suspect that that's going to happen, that there's going to be an effort to disable battery storage. But again, that is some of the devil in detail that will matter. And yeah, we want to make sure that as much as possible, right, this is enabling of loads that are willing to curtail their own computation. I mean, a little bit, it is sort of perverse to imagine if we end up in a situation that you can only do this via you know, solutions that do require very substantial upfront capital expenditures, rather than if you're willing to do so via your own compute-based flexibility. But because of some of these jurisdictional dynamics, it may be that for in service of a view of what's most legally defensible, will only focus on the case where you have a co-located generator or BESS system. So those are a couple. I mean, obviously, all this, in our view, should be voluntary. So if there's anything that sort of goes into a mandatory realm, you know, that becomes challenging. And we could probably go down the list a little further, but those are some of that are top of mind.
Great. What are the details on your mind, Miles?
Yeah. So I think one of the big details also is with regard to flexible interconnection, are we talking about a temporary option only or also a permanent one? You know, I think if you look across the country, a lot of the grid operators have spent more focus on the temporary option, which I do think is valuable. But it's also not the one that leads to the deepest customer savings, because if you do a temporary option, you are ultimately kind of planning full transmission build out. And so it's those kind of deeper, more permanent options that avoid that. So that's one thing. I'll be looking at the details of if there are transmission service products that come with this, what those mean. You know, like that's one of the disputes that has occurred in this PJM docket, is a non-firm service, but in fact, it's a non-firm service that you can only take when your generator is on outage, which means you can't use storage for that, right? So yeah, that's another one of the key details. And then I think also kind of, you know, how far do they go with regard to the modeling framework for any non-firm injection and withdrawal?
Yeah, I agree. The battery storage, whether you can use battery storage for flex, I think that will be one of the key things that will be looking for, and that will have huge implications for customers who want to achieve their sustainability goals. So I think that's going to be a super important detail. Another one will be, again, cost allocation. In the DOE order, there's language about the new load has to pay for the cost that they're responsible, or something like that, maybe 100% of the cost. But what does that actually mean? Especially, for example, if the new load is going to co-locate with an existing gen, for example, how are they going to calculate what the cost that configuration is going to cost for existing customers? A massively complicated question. Likewise, you know, network cost upgrade, what does that mean? What does it mean for the new load to pay for all of the network costs that they are responsible for? Is it because they triggered that network upgrade, they will have to pay for the entirety of that network upgrade, as the Pennsylvania PUC seems to think? Or, you know, do we take the traditional approach, the traditional cost allocation approach, looking at who the beneficiaries are. But yeah, I think those are going to be some of the important details.
I think for us, what some of the details, and when I say us, I mean, sorry, state of Colorado, for example. What some of the details that we should be or are looking into as well are, and going back to the jurisdictional issues, is if there are requirements or provisions regarding bring your own generation or co-location that particularly favor certain fuels, as we were indicating, that may be contrary to what our state goals are for decarbonization. That will be something that we would definitely not be in agreement, because we want to maintain authority over the capacity of regulate emissions within our state. I know that you were hoping to throw a bigger bomb here too, but
That's good. All right, I'm going to invite folks to start thinking about the questions that they might want to pose to our panelists. So think about if you want to stretch your legs and step up to one of the mics here. But while folks are gathering their thoughts, maybe one last question from me. I guess I'm curious if I can ask all of you to make a prediction about where we're going to be, say, 2 years from now, right? Are we going to be in a new renaissance of connecting flexible large loads in a way that accelerates speed to power and does all the other things that we've talked about could be benefits? Are we going to be having this exact same conversation at this same conference 2 years from now? Are we going to be somewhere in the middle? And I'm going to take notes to inform my polymarket position on this, but I would love the experts to opine kind of where do you think we're going to be in 2 years, and maybe a little bit about the why as well. Let's start at the other end. Let's put the consumer advocate on the spot first.
I was hoping I was not going to be the first one on this one. The cautious optimistic in me would like to be way ahead. I would like to have our large old tariff in place and in the process of reviewing already some of these applications from some of the utilities to present some of these large loads. That's where I would like to be or hope to be in the process of review. However, I'm not going to feed into your polymarket addiction, but I don't think we'll be that far ahead, unfortunately. I hope we are, but cautiously optimistic. Unfortunately, I don't think we will be that far ahead because, and I think a lot of that, I think tomorrow would be a better day to place that bet.
We got to lock in our positions now. So go ahead, Bob.
I think it will vary across the U.S., across North America. I think if experience to date is in any indication, I think we'll see a lot of progress in Texas and ERCOT SPP. I think we'll see some progress in MISO, California as well. PJM, I'm less optimistic. However, Southeast region, I think we will not see a whole lot of big changes in the Southeast. I'm also looking north to our Canadian friends for what they are doing up there. So, for example, in British Columbia, they came up with this multi-criteria framework in order to interconnect large loads, and they specify what criteria are important to the public good, and they also include a framework where large loads can, say, for example, bid their willingness to connect, and then the delta between the bid price and the cost to serve that large load is going to be passed back to all of the customers. And so they're also experimenting with lots of things up north, but of course in British Columbia it's a little bit easier because it is a crown corporation. But I do think that there will be developments in Canada and also in Europe that we will. I hope that can inspire work in the U.S. as well.
And I'll use my moderator prerogative to jump in here and say it's not just those two geographies, but also Southeast Asia. Malaysia has a similar structure around, in so many words, assessing the public value and the societal benefits of different construction for data centers and prioritizing accordingly. So
yeah, exactly. I mean, we haven't really talked about emissions a lot on this panel, but that is one of the criteria, that many public policy makers in other jurisdictions are looking at as well. So. Yeah.
One last thing that I want to mention, I hope I didn't interrupt you, but at least in the region that we are going back to the States, water will become an issue and is becoming an increasingly hot issue, literally hot issue. So I think what's happening in California, Colorado, and Utah with the Colorado River issue and all that will be a big determinant on what positions of the western region of the U.S. and where it goes as far as large load.
Can I ask you a follow-up question? Is it the larger macro conditions that are gonna make that conversation more urgent because of the drought, for example, or because the worry that data centers are using a lot of water? I'm reading the new, I'm seeing various data saying different things about this, or maybe it's both.
I was going to say it's both. I think in our state, we're not thinking of data centers just in the aspect of energy. It's intrinsically tied to water rights and water issues.
Great. So 2 years from now, we'll be talking about flexible interconnection for water. Good. Okay. Maybe not this conference. All right, Miles, you're up.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I would agree with Long that we're going to see different amounts of change in different regions. I think this is an area where there's been quite a diversity of views among utilities in terms of how much they're embracing this. And I think where utilities embrace it, we could move very fast. And, we've seen ERCOT has moved quickly. In SPP, the discussion has changed enormously over the course of the year, right? Like these products that you heard described earlier have all been developed in very quick succession. So I think you could see a lot. And even in the regions that are comparative laggards here, I do think that this is a faster moving. I mean, it depends on your perspective, right? Like I saw that the SunZia transmission line that I first worked on as an associate, like a very, very long time ago, just got energized, right? So some processes move slowly. I think here you have alignment. There's bipartisan alignment, right? Like I did not expect to be kind of coming out of the prior prior FERC and immediately thinking, hey, yes, this is a great thing you've proposed, Department of Energy under Trump, right? And so I think where you have alignment there from the regulators in wanting to find a path to connect load without creating those affordability and reliability impacts for existing customers, you're going to see faster movement than you see in a lot of areas. That's not to say it won't be a struggle and we'll be pulling teeth at PJM.
Unfortunately, transmission is a pretty low bar, but challenge accepted. Tyler, do you want to bring us home where we're going to be in 2 years?
Yeah, I mean, just echoing the speed of progress so far is remarkable. I mean, we were at the same workshop last June, and it was before like any of these new service tiers have been proposed, and then we had the INOPR. So I do think this is the direction of the system. I think FERC is going to send that signal very clearly tomorrow. I think we're going to get a unanimous decision, and I'm sure there'll be quirks, there'll be issues, they'll be imperfect, but I think it'll be loud and clear that this is the direction that we're moving the bulk power system. And I think we have to, because I think if we don't, then we're sort of getting behind a vision of the future where we're going to have massive islanded large loads that are going to be running on like super inefficient thermal units in a substantial majority of the cases. I don't think that's good for anyone, actually. And so I'm hopeful that we'll get a workable framework tomorrow and that we will see sort of more utilities really step up to the plate on this. And I think they have a great opportunity to do so. I think we're already starting to see momentum, but look, like they ultimately hold the keys. And so if they don't want to play ball, it's going to be difficult. But I think if they will, then I think we can make a lot of progress fast. So.
Great. Good. Well, I like ending on that note of optimism. Let's go to questions. So David, I think you're up first.
Thanks. David Huzzy, ISO New England. I'm in operations engineering, and so forgive me if I'm like missing a bunch of reasons why this may not work, but I hear things like we want to kind of be able to absorb the excess capacity that's on the grid right now. You know, we want to be dispatchable to alleviate constraints and all that stuff. And I hear that's what the wholesale energy market does, right? So what are the barriers to going straight into the wholesale energy markets? Like, is there, I might be missing something obvious, but.
Are you just saying like go and integrate with SCED? Is that?
Yeah, like what prevents you from registering as a wholesale market participant, right?
Yeah. So on the interconnection side, oh, sorry. Yeah, and I mean, this is where things get distinguished, right? In terms of the interconnection study, without having a non-firm interconnection option that sort of links the transmission service, you have to have the completion of all firm network upgrades before you can access the system. So that's why it is totally contingent on the planning realm as the first enabling sort of piece here. But yes, once you're on the system in the operational realm, in terms of the best way to manage this, like I think there's a very credible case that like the fastest plug and play way to do this, that would be the simplest for the operators. And this, of course, is ERCOT's position, is that just go like integrate with our existing system, which you go into SCED. Right. And so I think we could have a more nuanced conversation around sort of the pros and cons and whether that's going to be enabling or not. I mean, I do think without a true netting structure, it's going to be difficult if we have to like fully separate registration of the load only from, you know, any associated. Sure. So I think there's still a lot to kind of work through there. Yeah. But does that make sense? It kind of does,
and maybe is the missing part for me that's the interconnection process with the transmission owner. Is that the part where you have to go through and get that firm service? Yeah. Can you become your own transmission owner and become a utility? Like if you're operating at that scale, why not just become a utility?
Yeah, no, look, we should have a whole workshop on merchant transmission. And yeah, it's a big topic. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, a good one. I don't know that we can tackle it here right now.
That's fair. Totally fair.
Yeah. But happy hour, totally okay to tackle it during happy hour. Yeah, let's go over here.
I'm on this. Donnie Hollischutz with Interview. I have a quick question related to these graphs, and just wanted to know if at the beginning is that a benefit essentially that you're seeing there?
No, at the beginning it's not. It's a cost. Yeah. It's okay. Cost. If it's positive, then it's a cost to existing customer. If it's negative, then it's a benefit for existing customer.
Okay. Yeah. I just want to clarify that to get that. But my question is related to that, or to, you know, the impact to the customers essentially. So when we look at all the forecasts around different planning regions and looking at how the forecasts are being done, a lot of the forecasts are not capturing like an envelope of uncertainty essentially. Perhaps, you know, the high end, like what could be an extreme scenario for high demand for data centers, but not necessarily the low scenarios, which would create a risk for the end customer, which is stranded costs, stranded assets, essentially. Have anybody looked at any type of analysis of what could be the potential impact of a lot of this demand not being realized for the end consumer essentially, and what does that mean in terms of potential risk for future development of more AI data centers?
Yeah, I'll start and maybe others can chime in. I think it is a huge risk, and I think that's why load forecast is a super important exercise for the moment. And I'll put in a plug for the ESIC report on load forecast that I would highly recommend. So it is a huge risk that if you planned for 400 gigawatt of new load in Texas, for example, and they don't materialize, it's more of a problem in RTOs with a capacity market like PJM, for example, or it's also a huge problem for utilities that go out there and build their own generation capacity, for example. And one of the ways, and tariff is one of the ways that utilities are trying to mitigate this risk by requiring large customers to put up certain collateral amount and asking them to enter into take or pay provisions regardless of how much how much of the load will actually materialize. So, and I think bringing back to this panel, I think that's why flexible interconnection is also really important, because it provides this optionality value while you wait and see how much load is actually going to materialize. You can provide this interruptible service, flexible service, without having to commit major new transmission generation investments in the meanwhile.
Just from our experience here in Colorado, when we started this whole process in the JTS proceeding that I was mentioning, the term, it wasn't flexible, it was speculative load came up a lot. And this referred to the modeling and the load modeling that that Excel had presented. And when we started to try to run the same models and replicate all this, it didn't work. So even the commission eventually decided to go with a more conservative forecast than that. And so what we integrated in the process was a process that reviewed the different stages in which these supposed or estimated large loads would come into place. So we have like percentages, and and each, like, let's say at 10%, they have these loads. 20%, it means that they've signed a letter of intent, or 30% they've signed an actual ESIG or a distribution agreement. So what we're trying to integrate is a process that analyzes and reviews where in the pipeline these large loads are with the company. And that not only lets us decrease the level of uncertainty from these loads, but also lets us analyze issues like flexibility and location and other issues that relate to these large loads.
Let's go to Matthew.
Thanks everybody for your time. Matthew Crosby, Cypress Creek. Following that kind of conversation, I'm really interested in your thoughts about transparency and about how we transition from what is essentially an entirely opaque load queue to a more transparent FERC jurisdictional world. And the related question is, Mark, your bet on where we're going to be in a couple of years. Like, FERC Order 2023 spilled a lot of ink in terms of how we got from the world that was pre-existing to the world that we wanted. And there was a lot of thought about how we transition, right? And so I'm just curious if folks have any thoughts about moving to a more transparent queue, subject to higher, readiness requirements, and what should be the transition to that process?
Who wants to take that? Try to jump in. Sorry. I guess, I think that the transition will necessarily be hard here because you're in a setup where in some jurisdictions, a lot of energy service agreements have already been signed. And so that just naturally makes it hard to transition to a new system. I think you need to come up with some cutoff And this is why urgency matters so much. I think there has to be some level of commercial certainty for people who have already negotiated contracts. But I think the sooner regulators can say, okay, now is the cutoff point, everything else will be done according to a set of rules that we're going to write, that would make a lot of sense. So you have to have kind of a set of criteria around what milestones are going to need to be met for you to be grandfathered. And this has been done all the time on the generator side, right? As transmission providers have come up with new processes to interconnect generators, they have had to come up with those transitions, and it's been messy, but it has largely worked, I would say. You know, that has not been the biggest problem with generator interconnection. So yeah, I think you do need to kind of get a set of rules written down. And I also think that's where it makes sense to try to skip ahead a little bit. Like, we're seeing this natural process from no rules to rules for a serial process to rules for a cluster process to then trying to do something more akin to like the forward-looking, SPP process around consolidated planning. And hopefully we can skip to that latter thing, right, as the first step, because I think things are moving so quickly that it just seems like that is already appropriate.
It's a much bigger conversation to have, which I don't know if we're equipped in this exact moment for, but I will say, with respect to this kind of creation of the non-firm service tiers, transparency also becomes really important, right? Because if we are going to take on the risk of adopting as available service, we need to, in order to do the proper risk characterization around the curtailment, we need to have some sense of how likely it is that another large load is also going to come in as non-firm in an electrically proximate way, in a way that could just totally blow up that risk characterization. So we need to have like very clear, as much transparency as possible, of course, on the queue, but also just like very clear rules on the road of like how firm versus non-firm, and then each non-firm customer is being treated in terms of like curtailment prioritization.
But having a load interconnection queue would also help you improve your risk characterization a little bit, right? Playing the devil's advocate here.
I'll just say for myself, coming from the generator side, I mean, it's shocking to like look at our large load interconnection process. I mean, there's no process, right? Some jurisdictions now are setting up a process, but it is remarkable. There's a lot more to say on that, but
All right, let's go to the last question from Gene. Thanks.
Thank you. Gene Duran, NextEra Energy Resources. I'm really glad Leslie brought up water commodities because that is a major part. The Guardian reported that 97% of data centers are being built in arid climates that are currently experiencing a drought. This is the arid climate reason is because that's better for the power components and things. But unfortunately, that means you're building in places that likely have very little water. So I do have a three-way parlay here where like I believe that FERC is going to make rulemaking on water commodities, maybe even because they do have jurisdiction on interregional commerce, and one of those is water, that they're going to potentially require data centers to think of closed loop water systems and potentially sourcing water from places that are not undergoing a drought. And so therefore, my second sort of parlay is that we're going to be talking about water at the next ESIG. And I do have a third one here about energy efficiency, but that was related to a question I had about like performance-based rate making for large loads. But to focus on water, how is water or even energy efficiency, commodity efficiency, shall we say, being thought of in terms of these contracts that are being formed, between the utilities and these data centers? Because yeah, some have said they're using closed loop water systems. Others say, no, we're drawing from the local. So I'm just kind of curious how water is being considered in all of this, especially in terms of the design proposals for a data center in the first place.
All right, so I think our panelists should take this in the spirit of setting up the conversation we're going to have next year at ESIG per Gene's question. But welcome quick responses, and then I think we're right at time. So anyone who wants to offer a response to that can go ahead.
I brought the bomb of water into the conversation, the water balloon, I guess it would be, into the conversation. There you go, there, thank you. But our office and the utility regulator that we're working with does not regulate water. So it's been maintained as a completely separate conversation. This is a conversation that the utility is not engaged in. It's probably a conversation that they're having at a state level or at a legislature level with directly with the developers of these centers. Again, going back to the principle that not all large loads are created equal, so we're not specifically in the case of data centers, when they come to Colorado, they are the issue of water is not even mentioned. Unfortunately, we mention it, and other interveners in these proceedings mention it. The enviros mention it, and other maybe staff of the public utilities kind of hints of it because it's out of their jurisdiction. But it needs to be part of the conversation, although it's kind of not being spoken up. When these large loads and specifically data centers come, what they're saying is they add all these benefits of potential new jobs and potentially coming here and locating here because the state of Colorado is not subject to the effects of climate change, for example, as much as other states. And however, I do want to make the caveat of wildfires, but I do think that we should not have the conversation of water so siloed from everything else that we are.
So I'll connect one dot here, which is I think there's actually a lot to learn from water rights in the West and how we've actually come up with non-firm versus firm. And there's a great paper on this that was released, at least a preprint last fall, called Allocating Scarcity by Alexandra Klass and David Owen. Alexandra Klass is a professor at the University of Michigan. And so they do case studies on both natural gas and water in terms of non-firm versus firm access rights. So I think there's a lot actually to be learned from those industries as we think about this future system. So you might find interest in that.
And I guess I would just say, as somebody who spent a lot of time at FERC trying to encourage staff to take on fights they didn't want to take on, I will take the other side of your poly-market bet of FERC regulating water use of data centers. And if I were a state regulator, I would definitely want to be stepping into that void because, I think there'll be a lot of hesitation for it to take that on. I have not seen water as part of the discussion in the tariff rules world that I'm in at all.
Great. Well, let's wrap up there. I hope that we didn't get on the wrong side of ESIG's antitrust guidance with all the discussion of the poly-market positions. Please join me in thanking our panelists for joining us today. And with that, unless there's anything that Debbie wants to say, but there is. Great.
Yeah, so I just wanted to thank everyone for making the time to join us here. It was a fantastic workshop, really happy to have all the engagement. I realize they're not in the room, but I just wanted to thank Ryan, Lacey, and Brooke for doing all the logistics to put this together. So they're not here, but this is being recorded. So let's just give them a round of applause for they make these things possible. And members and all of you make this possible as well. I also wanted to mention there is a reception that Encord is graciously sponsoring at their office. So if you need information on that, let me know and I can give that to you. And we hope to see you again at the next ESIG event. We're going to be in right outside of DC in October. So hopefully we'll see you then. In the meantime, safe travels and take care. Bye.
Thank you.